I think what you can observe about Hitchcock's work is that because he came from a background of an art director, he was interested in exploring all aspects of filmmaking. Certainly, he was well versed on special effects and would find new ways to use existing special effect techniques as a part of his storytelling process. Hitchcock loved matte paintings, for example. There's matte paintings all through Alfred Hitchcock films. Rear projection shots, optical shots. He had a way of reinventing existing techniques and finding ways to make them even more special. And Menzies is somebody that really breaks all the rules. In Hollywood, traditional filmmaking, you have, specific categories that people do their jobs in. The art director, the cinematographer, the director. Menzies was shaking everything up. He was, radical. He was out there. He was doing stuff that nobody else was doing. For example, one of the films that he had worked on and contributed heavily to was Selznick's Gone with the Wind. And Selznick was so appreciative of his contribution to that film that he created a different title than art director for Menzies. And that is, instead of art director, he gave him the title of production designer. And that would be then a new title that Menzies would continue to use, as well as other production designers in cinema. But Menzies was unique in a way that was different than other art directors because he could do so many things. He could direct, he could consult with the cinematographer, in some cases designing the set and designing the camera angles. And that was unusual, that somebody would be so involved in the production that he would control every aspect of the visual contribution to the film. In fact, it was so unusual that sometimes he rubbed people the wrong way. In Gone with the Wind, Menzies was responsible for the visual production of the film. So he would draw designs for what the camera would see in the same way that Hitchcock did. Hitchcock liked to storyboard every sequence, and Menzies did that as well. So I could see them working very closely together and enjoying each other's abilities because they like to design film from the standpoint of a pre-production process. So of course, a lot of films today don't have this additional component of design. They go out on location and you make a film. Not so on a film with Alfred Hitchcock or Menzies. They would design every shot in advance so that they would know what the lens would be, how high the camera would be off the floor, whether it's photographing one or two people, how the sequences were put together, all designed in a pre-production process. So this would save money. It would be very efficient because everybody would know exactly what they needed to do on location. In the case of Foreign Correspondent, Menzies worked more like a director working with Hitchcock and was in charge of the seaplane sequence when it crashes in the ocean. Menzies would set up the shots, and of course Hitchcock might be shooting on another stage and would come over and approve the different shots that Menzies was doing, and then he would go ahead and film them, and then Hitchcock would come back and do additional close-ups or things that he wanted to do with the actors as well. But it was definitely a collaboration. The overall visual effects supervisor was Paul Egler, and he worked with Selznick before. And of course, he would be working closely with Menzies, who would be in charge of those sequences, so that they looked realistic, so they didn't stand out and look obvious as special effects. That's kind of the whole key about traditional visual effects, is to make them feel like they're in the picture, like they belong in the film. It's not something that pulls you out as being something that's fake or something that doesn't look real. And all the shots in Foreign Correspondent are very effective. There's a sequence of the windmills. And of course, this had to be created because they didn't actually film in Holland. They had to create that sequence in Hollywood. So there's three different things going on. There's location work out at Seal Beach in Los Angeles. There's an interior soundstage where they built a full-size windmill with a painted backing and a set. And then there's the interior of those windmills, which would then be on yet another set. So all that's coming together to make that sequence. And it starts with a beautiful, what we call a matte painting shot. And a matte painting is a piece of artwork painted by an artist that is then photographed separately and then combined into the scene to make the final illusion. You see 3 windmills, all turning, and the live action portion is the cars coming in frame down the road. A black mask is then placed in the scenes where the matte painting is going to be added to later. The matte painting then by itself shows the windmills, the sky, the landscape in the distance, and has the added element of the windmill sails actually turning, and they're actually protruding through the matte painting and turning. So if you looked at the painting, you would see the painting with these actual turning elements as part of it. So it's a stencil, so to speak, or a jigsaw puzzle of the 2 elements coming together. And the artistry goes into blending it to make sure that the transition between the painting and the live action is undetectable. It's a great matte painting. It's one of my favorite shots actually in the film because it's a fun composite, it is an illusion, and it just so beautifully sets up the sequence. Talking about, let's say, the interior of the windmill set, that is just a tour de force for a suspense sequence. Now, everything there is completely designed. Every shot, what you're seeing, it's not arbitrary. It's planned out in advance through a design process. And there's a beautiful shot where Joel McCrea is up on top of the staircase looking down at the bad guys. And it just happens to be an example of what we call triangular composition, where if you think of a triangle with Joel McCrea at the top and the bad guys at the bottom, at the base, when you look at that, your eye goes into that and you just go up and down the triangle. You know, it pulls your eye into the scene. And so they're thinking about how you view the movie in a whole different level. There's another really terrific matte painting shot, which is the Hotel Europe, which is sort of fun because it's a joke. When Joel McCrea is climbing out of his bedroom window and he accidentally touches the neon sign, you know, the sign breaks, and so instead of it saying Hotel Europe, it says Hot Europe, and this was, you know, obviously a little inside joke to sort of make reference to the turmoil that was going on in Europe at the time. And then the E in Europe is real, but then the U-R-O-P-E is actually just painted in. And a set was built of just the very top floors of the hotel. And that set would have actually been on the soundstage floor. So he wouldn't really be high up. He would just literally be a foot or 2 off the floor of the stage. So in that scene, first they would photograph Joel McCrea coming out of his window. That would be a practical effect that they would do on the set. Then a painting would be created to extend the hotel and the floors below, and then that would be combined again as a composite process to complete the scene. And the extra added little value to that is that as Joel McCrea breaks the hotel sign, he makes a noise and a light turns on in one of the lower floors, which is actually a painted effect. It's a gag. It's in the matte painting as if to suggest that he made some noise and it was waking somebody up. So that's just, you know, an extra little idea that the special effects people had to sort of make it look like it was a real scene and not something that was created as a visual effect.
What is it? They've gone crazy. What do they think they're doing? Who are they? What is it?
I think that the sequence of the airplane crash would be very effective to audiences in the 1940s, mostly because it's very effective today. And it's serious. I mean, people are drowning. And the way they did it was, of course, they actually physically had water filling up the set. And at a certain point, the actors, as they got to the top of the airplane fuselage, it was made of paper, so that as the water filled up the complete set, they could just poke their head through the top and breathe. That was kind of an ingenious way to do that. Of course, the water was very cold. It must have been very uncomfortable to film that. I'm sure they spent a lot of time shooting that sequence. In some ways, I think Hitchcock was smart to give it to Menzies to do, because, you know, it was probably miserable to get that all on camera. If you notice, Also, what's very effective is the camera is handheld. There's a sense that when the water comes in, the camera's moving around, and that's very unusual for that time. You know, a lot of visual effects shots tended to be static camera, where you couldn't move the camera, but the techniques that they used for this sequence allowed them to move the camera, and there's even one mistake in the film. When the water comes in, you can see the cameraman accidentally tilted up too far, and he actually tilts off the set, and you see studio lighting. You see babies and inkies, and it doesn't belong in a seaplane. It's just a glimpse of it. You can see the camera tilt up and then immediately tilt back down. Oops, I shot off the set. But they didn't cut it out. I guess they figured that it was such a fast reveal that it didn't bother anybody. And of course, it's a great moment to sort of have that unsteadiness in the photography, reacting to the water rushing in. So they kept it in the film. The first shot is what's called the Empire flying boat. This was made by the Short brothers. They made these flying boats, and they were very popular up to and during the war, especially because they didn't necessarily have all the airports set up so this airplane could land on the water and be effective as a way to travel around the world. So they established a scene by a miniature of the Empire flying boat flying, which is pretty straightforward. And then, of course, during the whole sequence of the attack,
Can you come out, sir? They're all going nuts in there. All right, Stokes, I'll be out immediately.
when the German destroyer shoots at them, they made some very interesting choices as far as how that sequence was created. All the moments are experienced through the pilot, meaning that the pilot views the fuselage or the airplane wing coming apart, or the explosion. Everything is from his point of view so that you see through his eyes the fear of what's happening, and then the audience then can immediately connect to being engaged in the sequence. This is Hitchcock's, signature approach to filmmaking, is to not show establishing shots that pull you out of the picture, but to always find ways to keep you engaged in what's happening during the sequence. And as it sinks, it's progressively getting more and more filled with water until finally they climb out onto the wing, which is then yet another setup where the wing is out on the water. And that sequence is also beautifully done because you have your actors on the wing, on a tank in the foreground, with then a composite of a stormy sea behind them. And again, the illusion is very effective in how those elements were put together. And it adds a lot to that sequence to see your actors actually in danger, your stars in a dangerous situation. Those shots were done more with an optical process of combining the two elements together, because there are limits to how big the rear projection screen can be. The larger the screen you make, the dimmer the image, because you're dealing with light that then has to be rephotographed by a camera. And so the larger the screen, the dimmer it is, the harder it is to photograph. So rear projection is excellent for smaller sizes. I think the effectiveness of that sequence probably led Hitchcock to believe that he could make a film like Lifeboat, which is, again, a similar idea where your characters are very isolated in a lifeboat, and then you have to create the ocean around them. It's essentially a big visual effects picture because every shot has to be an illusion of your actors. Not practical to really shoot them out on the ocean, so you have to create it in some other way on the set using special effects to create that illusion. One of my favorite shots is the point of view of the seaplane crashing into the water. So you're inside the cockpit and you see the water rushing towards you, coming closer and closer to the cockpit window, and then the water smashing through the window and into the cockpit to flood the scene. It's all done as one shot, not in cuts, and so there's a bit of trickery involved in how they were able to create that. And so the way they did that was there is a stunt pilot named Paul Mance. He had a camera mounted on the front of his airplane, and out at Santa Monica he dove his plane with the camera recording the ocean until the very last minute, and he pulled out so that he could, on that piece of film, have an element of the water rushing toward you. And of course, you know, he had to pull out in time. So, you know, imagine that. You know, you have to fly toward the ocean as close as you can to make the shot work, but not kill yourself. So this was clearly a lot of skill was involved in his ability to shoot that special piece of film. So then that piece of film is projected on a screen. We see a lot of rear projection shots in movies, usually as actors are driving cars. The scene behind them is rear projected behind them so they can have dialogue and talk and not actually worry about driving the car while they're talking. But this is a much more complicated use of the technique, rear projection. So they would have the scene of the ocean projected on a screen made out of paper. It was actually made out of rice paper. And the reason why is because it's going to have to be shattered by water. We could see the camera photographing the cockpit set with the rear projection screen of the water. And the water rushing toward the camera was projected by the rear projector on the far left. That was projecting the image of the water on the screen. The two dump tanks had, according to Hitchcock, 2,700 gallons each in them. And so obviously timing was everything. Then at a specific moment, the dump tanks have the water shoot down these slides, smash through the rear projection screen and into the cockpit to create the final shot. Hitchcock had mentioned that they made 6 of these special rice paper rear projection screens. So we know they had 6 chances to do it. I suspect that they probably did it on the first or second take because I think it's just a matter of getting the timing right. And if you look very closely, there are a few frames where you can see the water tear through the rear projection screen. There's a little tear and you can see the water start to come in that betrays the illusion just slightly, but it's only if you have, you know, the modern DVD machine or where you can go back frame by frame. Audiences of the day wouldn't have been able to tell that that's how the shot was done. One thing that was interesting was that the sequence of the assassination with the umbrellas, apparently it was a concern how many extras they were going to have. And Hitchcock came up with the idea of giving them all umbrellas, so essentially you needed half the amount of people to fill out that scene. Now, again, this might be a story, you know, this sounds a little bit like a gag, but I don't know, these guys are pretty smart. So a lot of times the scenes that we really admire come as a solution to a problem that we didn't know was a problem. And that's really the hallmark of a great filmmaker, is to sort of take the problems or the challenges you have and make them work for you so that it creates something new that you didn't think of, or that because of the problem it's actually even better than had you not originally thought of it. So that's the hallmark of a great decision, great director, to be able to take problems and make them advantages in the storytelling process.